On the night of her wedding, she was sent away to start a new life, but fate had other plans. As she stepped into her husband's home, an eerie presence whispered in the shadows. Little did she know, she wasn't the only one living there. The village was alive with the sounds of celebration. Drums echoed through the narrow pathways, and lanterns flickered against the evening sky. Women in bright, embroidered shawls danced in circles, their laughter masking the quiet sorrow of the girl seated in the center of it all. Layla. That was her name. A name that once carried dreams, now weighed down by fate. She sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wrists adorned with golden bangles that jingled with every breath. The henna on her palms, meant to symbolize joy, felt more like shackles. Tonight was her wedding night, a night she had not chosen for herself. Her father stood beside her, his expression solemn. He was a man of tradition, bound to the customs of their ancestors. A girl's destiny is to be married, he had told her when she begged for another path. To refuse is to bring dishonor. Dishonor. The word had been enough to silence her protests. Now, as she prepared to leave behind the home she had known since childhood, she felt a deep unease settle in her chest. It was not just the sorrow of a forced marriage, it was something else, something unseen. The moment came swiftly. Her groom, a man nearly twice her age, stood waiting by the threshold. He was respected, wealthy, a man of high status in their village. But his eyes were empty, his smile forced. As the final wedding rites were completed, Layla was placed in the decorated palanquin, her face veiled, her heart heavy. The village women sang as they carried her away, their voices a mix of joy and sorrow. She did not cry. She had already shed her tears in the privacy of her room, knowing they would change nothing. The journey to her new home was long. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and an unsettling silence settled over the procession. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of rustling leaves seemed almost like whispers, soft, indistinct, yet unervingly present. By the time they arrived at the groom's house, a large, ancient structure standing on the edge of the village, Layla's skin prickled with unease. The house loomed before her, its wooden beams worn by time, its walls heavy with an unspoken history. A small gathering awaited her, relatives of the groom, servants who bowed their heads as she entered. The older women guided her inside, murmuring words of welcome, but their eyes avoided hers. She was led to the bridal chamber, a dimly lit room adorned with silk drapes and flickering lanterns. A marriage bed, dressed in crimson and gold, stood at the center. The air smelled of incense, thick and heavy. As she sat on the bed, waiting for her husband to join her, an unnatural silence pressed against her ears. The celebrations outside seemed distant, muffled, as if the house itself was cut off from the world beyond its doors. A gust of wind slipped through the window, though it had been bolted shut. The flame of the lantern flickered wildly before stilling. Layla shivered. Something was wrong. The walls, the air, the very floor beneath her feet, everything felt watching. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint. Just a breath of sound. She turned sharply, her heart pounding. The room was empty. She told herself it was exhaustion, the strain of the day catching up with her. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was not alone. Layla's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the dimly lit chamber. The whisper had been faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Yet, something deep within her knew, she was not alone. The lantern flickered again, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Her fingers clutched the fabric of her wedding dress as she tried to steady herself. She told herself it was nerves, exhaustion from the long journey and the weight of what had just transpired. But then, the whisper came again. Soft. Lingering. It was not the wind. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she turned her head toward the farthest corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. Nothing moved, yet the air carried a strange stillness, as if something unseen was holding its breath. Layla swallowed hard. A sudden knock on the door made her jump. She exhaled sharply, her pulse hammering against her ribs. It was the groom's mother, an elderly woman with deep lines of age carved into her face. "You should rest," the old woman said, her tone firm yet distant. "Your husband will be here soon." Layla nodded mechanically, forcing herself to breathe. The door shut again, and she was alone once more. She sat rigid, staring at the doorway, half expecting something, someone, to emerge from the darkness. The whisper had not come again, but the room still felt heavy, as if the walls held secrets they dared not speak aloud. Then she noticed it. The mirror. It stood tall against the opposite wall, its frame gilded with intricate carvings. She had not given it much thought before, but now, something about it unsettled her. The reflection of the lantern's glow shimmered unnaturally across the glass, as though the surface rippled like water. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She rose hesitantly, her bare feet pressing against the cool floor as she took slow steps toward the mirror. Her breath was shallow, every movement measured. As she drew closer, she saw her own reflection, wide eyes, tense shoulders, her veil slightly askew. But there was something else. A shadow. Faint. Behind her. Her body froze. The figure stood at the very edge of the reflection, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. It was motionless, yet she could feel its presence, watching, waiting. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. She spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty. Her breaths came in sharp bursts as she whipped her head back to the mirror. The shadow was gone. Layla stumbled backward, gripping the wooden post of the bed for support. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear open the doors and demand to be taken back home. But she could not. She had been given away, bound to this marriage. There was no return. Trembling, she clutched the amulet around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, a charm meant to ward off evil. "Protect me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A gust of wind rushed through the room, rattling the wooden shutters. The lantern's flame flared violently before extinguishing, plunging the chamber into darkness. Layla's breath hitched. Then the whisper came again. But this time it was closer. Right behind her. Layla's body stiffened, every muscle locked in place. The whisper had been unmistakable this time, not a trick of the wind, not a fragment of her exhausted mind. It was real. Cold air brushed against the back of her neck, a sensation so tangible that she felt the tiny hairs on her skin rise in response. She wanted to run, to throw open the doors and escape into the night, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The silence stretched unbearably. Then something shifted. A rustling sound, like fabric moving, came from behind her. Layla sucked in a sharp breath. Slowly, too slowly, she turned her head. The room remained empty. The bed, untouched. The curtains, still. The mirror, a dark, vacant reflection of the unlit chamber. Yet the feeling persisted, that dreadful certainty that she was not alone. Her fingers clutched at the amulet around her neck, pressing it against her chest. She forced herself to breathe, though each inhale felt shallow, constricted. And then, a voice. Soft, almost mournful. "Leave." The single word wrapped around her like an unseen force, its weight pressing into her bones. It was neither harsh nor threatening, but filled with an urgency that made her heart hammer wildly. Layla's lips parted, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" Silence. She strained to hear anything beyond the rapid beat of her own heart. The whisper returned. "Go, before it's too late." A chill crept into her limbs, but she refused to be paralyzed by fear. She forced her shaking legs to move, stumbling toward the lantern. Her fingers fumbled in the darkness as she relit the flame, its glow flickering against the walls. She turned in every direction, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Yet the feeling lingered, a suffocating presence that refused to lift. The door creaked. Layla spun around just as her husband stepped inside. The light barely reached him, casting his face in half-shadow. His dark eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, his expression unreadable. There was something unsettling about the way he stood, too still, too controlled. "You're awake," he said, his voice steady. Layla swallowed hard, nodding. She could not bring herself to speak, not when her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. Her husband stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. The lock clicked into place, the sound oddly final. "You seem afraid," he observed, his eyes never leaving her. She forced a breath through her lips. "It's this house." He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "What about it?" She hesitated. Would he believe her if she told him the truth? That something, someone, had spoken to her? That the very walls of this place seemed to hold secrets they were desperate to reveal? "I heard something," she admitted carefully. "A voice." His expression did not change. If anything, he seemed completely unfazed. "This house is old," he said. "It makes sounds in the night. You'll get used to it." Layla's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "It wasn't the house. Someone spoke to me." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed his face. "There's no one here but us." The words carried an edge, a finality that made her blood run cold. Layla's mind raced. The warning had been clear: leave before it's too late. But why? What was she being protected from? Her husband took another step closer. The lantern's glow flickered in his eyes, revealing something unsettling beneath the surface. Something that made the whispers seem far less terrifying in comparison. For the first time, Layla wondered, was the danger truly from the spirits? Or from the man she had just married? Layla's breath felt trapped in her throat. The flickering lantern barely illuminated her husband's face, but the glint in his eyes sent a shiver through her bones. The spirits had warned her, whispered their desperate plea in the dark, but she had yet to understand why. A tense silence stretched between them. Her husband took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "There is nothing to fear here," he said, his tone oddly controlled. "You're tired. The journey has unsettled you." Layla swallowed, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her dress. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the shadows shifting uneasily, as though they, too, recoiled from his presence. The whispers had not been meant to frighten her. They had been a warning. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she forced herself to ask, "Why did they say I should leave?" Her husband's face remained expressionless, but the air between them changed, an invisible weight pressing down. The lantern's light wavered again, casting elongated shadows across the room. "They," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Layla's hands trembled. She had seen the figure in the mirror. She had heard the voice whispering in the dark. Whatever haunted this house did not want her here, but not because of the spirits. Because of him. She took a cautious step back, her mind racing. If she ran now, where would she go? The doors were locked. The windows were shuttered. The house was deep within his land, far from the village, far from anyone who could hear her scream. But she had to try. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden beams of the old house. The flame of the lantern sputtered, and for a moment, darkness swallowed the room. Then, a whisper. Not just one, but many. A chorus of voices, urgent, insistent. "Run." The lantern's flame flared back to life just as Layla lunged for the door. Her hands fumbled at the latch, pulling desperately, but it did not budge. Her husband moved fast, too fast. His fingers curled around her wrist, yanking her back before she could react. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You are my wife now. You belong here." "No," Layla gasped, struggling against his grip. "Something isn't right. This house." "This house," he interrupted, tightening his hold, "is mine. And so are you." The whispers swelled, filling the room like a rising tide. The air grew thick, the walls groaning under an unseen force. Then, the mirror cracked. A thin, jagged line splintered across the glass, spreading outward like veins of ice. Layla's breath caught. The room trembled as though the very foundation of the house was shifting beneath them. Her husband's grip loosened for the briefest moment, just enough. Summoning every ounce of strength, Layla twisted free and stumbled backward. The voices grew louder, a deafening hum filling the air. The cracked mirror shimmered, distorting, revealing. A woman. Pale, sorrowful, dressed in wedding silks now worn and tattered. Her hollow eyes locked onto Layla's, pleading, warning. And then, her lips moved. "You are not the first." Layla's blood ran cold. A gust of wind tore through the room, shattering the lantern's flame completely. The room plunged into darkness. A hand, ice-cold, brushed against Layla's arm. Not her husband's. The spirits were not here to hurt her. They were here to help. A sudden force pushed her, guiding her toward the window. She didn't hesitate. With shaking hands, she yanked it open, the wooden frame creaking in protest. Outside, The night stretched endlessly, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the land. She climbed through, landing unsteadily on the damp ground below. Behind her, she heard a furious shout, her husband, realizing too late what was happening. Layla ran. Her feet pounded against the earth, the wind whipping at her veil. The whispers followed her, not as warnings, but as encouragement, guiding her toward the trees, toward freedom. She did not stop. Not when she heard the door of the house slam open. Not when she heard her husband's furious steps behind her. Not even when the whispers faded, their task complete. She ran until the house was nothing but a distant shadow in the darkness. Until she was free. And, as dawn broke over the horizon, Layla stood at the edge of the village, her lungs burning, her body trembling. She turned back one last time, looking toward the house that had nearly become her grave. The spirits had spoken, and she had listened. Her life was now her own. "You said,"